Good morning and welcome to Climate and Conservation Policy Options for Arizona's Changing Landscape, a session of Arizona's Environmental Day. My name is Clara Summers, and I am the Climate and Energy Manager at the National Caucus of Environmental Legislators, or NCEL. I am joined by my colleagues Ruth Musgrave, who is the Senior Advisor for Conservation here at NCEL, and Kate Burgess, who's the Conservation Coordinator for NCEL. We also have another speaker here today, Amanda Ormond of the Western Grid Group, and they've all waved to you. Before I do anything else, I want to express my thanks to Representative Andrea Dalessandro for inviting NCEL to speak today, and to Sandy Bear of Sierra Club for organizing Environmental Day. It's really a fantastic event. So for those of you who don't know, NCEL is a nationwide network of more than 1,000 state legislators focused on shared learning and action. Our mission is to empower legislators to protect, conserve, and improve the natural and human environment. It's free and there's no obligation associated with joining the network. Next slide, please. So as you can see from the agenda, in a moment, I'm going to turn it over to Representative Dalessandro to frame our conversation. Then you will hear from Ruth and Kate about policy strategies to conserve Arizona's land and wildlife, followed by a presentation from Amanda and I on tackling climate change Arizona style. We will have question and answers afterwards, but you can feel free to put questions in the chat throughout. This briefing is being recorded, so a friendly reminder also to please keep yourself on mute. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Representative Andrea Dalessandro. Representative Dalessandro is a tireless champion for the environment and serves as the Arizona State Lead for NCEL. She is on the Natural Resources, Energy, and Water Committee, as well as the Land, Agriculture, and Rural Affairs Committee. Representative Dalessandro served 8 years in the Senate and is a highly experienced legislator. Representative?
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. And thank you to Clara and NCEL for working with me to do this today for our Environmental Day at the Capitol. You have been a wonderful resource, and it's so happy to see Ruth and the others on the Zoom meeting. I wish I could see you all in person like I did get to see some of you last year, but thank you for being here. Thank you for all the participants, and I look forward to what you have to say, because I believe Arizona is on the cusp of going forward with sustainable policies that will benefit us all. So thank you and enjoy.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Representative, and it's wonderful to see you. I just want to tell you all, I may have to turn my video off now and then because there are 3 people in my house using Zoom right now, but we'll get started. The first, NCEL works on conservation issues in a number of areas, but we thought we would focus today on 3 issues and talk to you about these issues as well as policy solutions. The first one is habitat connectivity, wildlife corridors, and recently Borderlands restoration. States are recognizing that wildlife corridors are natural areas that connect the core habitat, and wildlife crossings such as tunnel, fences, and bridges that allow plants and wildlife to move across roads are vital and cost-effective ways to maintain resilient ecosystems and to protect public health and safety on roads. So all of you know that native fish, wildlife, and plant species are declining across the United States. Habitat fragmentation can have lasting negative effects on wildlife and plant populations, as well as ecosystem functions such as water supply, and even community health and recreation. Species reduced access also threatens their ability to respond to changes in climate that are changing their food availability, their habitat, and seasonal patterns that they're used to. And as you know, Arizona is experiencing a long-term drought and other rapid climate changes. Meanwhile, state agencies are dealing with growing responsibilities while experiencing decreases in funding to address all the infrastructure needs and to protect habitat and wildlife. But at the same time, studies show that the best way to protect species and prevent biodiversity loss is to keep landscapes connected. Arizona, as you know, has some of the most spectacular biodiversity in North America. You have 500 species of birds, 3,500 plant species, and Kate will tell you all about your bees. The Sonoran Desert is the most biodiverse desert on Earth, and Arizona has an altitude change of over 12,000 feet. How's that for diversity? But Arizona also hosts part of the Southwest's unique regional connectivity issue, a huge impenetrable border wall. Border wall construction has been shown to cut off water flows, wildlife movement, and destroy soils, plant, and animal life for miles. And as you know, there are large, bare swaths of land on either side of the wall. It has also impacted cultures and economies. Private land has been taken and neighbors have been cut off from each other. Friends have been cut off across borders. So there is a national movement now to try to repair some of this damage. Next slide, please. This movement has 3 simple but effective recommendations to rebuild a sustainable economy and adapt to climate change, as well as reconnect people and cultures. These recommendations are being presented to the Biden administration for action. The first one is to restore riverine, riparian or streamside and wetland habitats. This includes, and I've seen it, installing erosion control structures such as rock dams, reseeding soils to restore native vegetation, and managing grazing to increase productivity and sustain soil health. The second simple solution is to identify and remove key segments of the wall that block critical wildlife corridors. This month, you may have heard a jaguar and an ocelot were both spotted near the border on the Arizona side. That has not been seen in years. So removing these small segments that block wildlife corridors for iconic animals like this would be done in cooperation with indigenous leaders who are also working to protect natural heritage and sacred sites. The third solution is to foster a restoration economy with jobs in a Borderlands conservation corps to meaningfully employ rural and indigenous communities, as well as youth and the under or unemployed near the border. So we have some policy options, next slide please, that states are considering, and this state is considering one of them. For Borderlands restoration, states are drafting memorials and introducing them to support the restoration. Those memorials ask Congress to consider these recommendations. Senator Gabaldon has introduced Senate Memorial 1001, and New Mexico has looked at her memorial, and they are now in drafting with several sponsors. Texas is also considering Borderlands restoration memorials. California is not able to do memorials or anything like that this year because of the pandemic, but they have a great program called the Riparian Habitat Conservation Program. So they can restore riparian areas using that because they have grants for people to do that work. Other states working on wildlife corridors and habitat connectivity include states like Virginia, who's got a bill right now sailing. It's gone through Senate already and it's sailing through the House. It's the second bill in Virginia. The first one was to request a wildlife corridor action plan. This bill requires agencies to incorporate wildlife corridors and crossings. Oregon had a same strategy. Last year, they required a wildlife corridor action plan, and this year, they're trying to get a study of issues related to funding wildlife corridor crossings. Then several states have considered resolutions, and Utah passed a resolution unanimously to support and or study opportunities and sites for conservation connectivity and corridors. Colorado and Pennsylvania have their bills drafted and ready to introduce. And then one of the last strategies states are using is to support funding for major wildlife corridor projects. Wyoming, of all states, is about to pass a major project funding for their wildlife migration corridors. And last year, they passed a bill that allows for voluntary donations for corridor conservation. So those are some of the policy options for habitat connectivity. We're happy to see that Arizona is actively involved. And I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Kate, to talk about pollinator protection. Kate?
Thanks, Ruth. Hi, all. My name is Kate Burgess. As Clara said, I'm the conservation coordinator with NCEL. I'm going to talk to you about pollinators. So what's all the buzz about? Pollinators are the bats, birds, butterflies, bees, moths, flies, beetles, and small mammals that visit flowers and transport pollen grains as they move from spot to spot, effectively helping plants reproduce. There are over 20,000 species of pollinators worldwide, 1,000 of which call Arizona home. In fact, Tucson is thought to host more kinds of bees than anywhere else in the world. And so these charismatic microfauna, in addition to being arguably adorable, support and provide life-sustaining benefits to people. For one, they help us eat. 1 out of every 3 bites of food you consume is provided by pollinators. They help us breathe and stay safe from storms, as pollinators support healthy environments that stabilize soils and clean air. They support our economy. It's thought that pollination services are worth more than $3 trillion worldwide. And they're also important cultural symbols, as pollinators help support the production of medicinal plants and plant-based dyes. Unfortunately, pollinators are in decline due to many factors, such as habitat loss and fragmentation, improper use of pesticides, disease and invasive species. In 2015 alone, over 40% of honeybees in the US were lost, and many other pollinating species are likely to continue on the same track if effort and action is not taken. We also know that Arizona is a crucial stop for monarch butterflies on their overwintering migration. And your state also hosts numerous native flowering nesting spots for other pollinators as well. So it can be overwhelming to think of all of the actions to take to support so many pollinating species. But there are several buckets of policy options that have been kind of tried and tested in many states across the US, including Arizona, that seem to have varying degrees of success. The first one of those buckets of policy options relates to habitat health. And I like to think of habitat health the same way that I think about it for humans, and that we all need a place to live and a way to get there. And so habitat health can look like a lot of different options. These are just 2. One is providing landowner incentives. And so this bill, or this program in Minnesota called Lawns to Legumes, provides funding to private landowners who are looking to turn their yards into pollinator-friendly habitats, effectively kind of building some habitat in your backyard. And another one to consider are migratory corridors for pollinators, as we know that pollinators do not abide by state political boundaries. They move across the United States. And so Ohio introduced a bill in 2017 to protect and preserve these pollinator hallways. In addition to habitat, pesticides are one of the largest drivers of pollinator decline. If you've ever eaten corn, broccoli, apples, or other vegetables and fruits, it's likely that you've been exposed to many of the pesticides that support agricultural productivity. But also exposure to these chemicals can reduce pollinators' ability to navigate, reproduce, and it can impair their memory as well. And they're also linked to many human health defects and issues as well. Among the highest pesticides of concern are neonicotinoids, otherwise known as neonics, chlorpyrifos, and glyphosate, which is the active ingredient in Roundup. There's going to be a test on all 3 of those, so I hope you paid attention. There have been some, interestingly, federal bans in other countries that ban the use and sale of these, but in the United States, we're mostly seeing state action kind of tackle restriction of sale and use. And so looking here to Arizona, recent action in Arizona that was introduced, those companion bills, SB1470 and HB2093 by Gabaldon and Dalessandro, restricts the use of neonics in Arizona. And then recently, 2 days ago, lots of sponsors probably on this call, I haven't looked at the participant list, have introduced a bill to prohibit the use and sale of, or the use of glyphosate on residential property. And so there's lots to do with pesticides that kind of get to those 3 main drivers of pollinator decline: glyphosate, chlorpyrifos, and neonics. And then a couple of other buckets of policy options have to do with funding and community engagement. So looking first to funding, There have been many creative ways that states have taken upon themselves to come up with ways to support pollinator health and pollinator habitat plans, one of which is in Virginia, among many other states, that introduce pollinator license plates that you can purchase to have cute little bees on your license plate, and the funds go to support healthy habitats for pollinators. And then also other states like Maryland have had funding mechanisms for relevant state agencies to develop a pollinator habitat plan, which kind of goes to studying important native areas, native plants and species that support particular pollinator health, obviously, respective to each state and what species are native there. And then lastly, I'll close with community engagement. I've found in my work that people want to be involved in this. My dad is always calling me and asking how he can plant butterfly bushes or pollinator plants in the backyard. And so it seems like citizens are interested in wanting to get involved, and these policies here reflect that. One in New Mexico, educating citizens on the importance of pollinators. In New Jersey, again, engaging private landowners, and also urban pollinator projects. As we know, some cities kind of intersect pollinator migration corridors, so it's important to consider pollinator habitat in urban areas as well. And so just closing, I'll say that there's lots of options for pollinators. Arizona seems to be a really unique microcosm of pollinator habitat and pollinator species. And so just looking forward to seeing what 2021 brings for these tiny little creatures. And with that, I will pass it back over to Ruth.
Thank you so much, Kate. The last thing we're going to talk about in conservation is the crisis of zoonotic disease spread, which is what we are in right now. And my computer's telling me my internet's unstable, so I'm going to turn my camera off for a minute. So zoonotic disease is what caused COVID-19. These are pandemics caused by pathogens that are spread between animals and humans. 1 billion people have some form of zoonotic disease right now, and humans have virtually no immunity to most zoonoses. They're often transmitted human to human, back to livestock, to wildlife, from wildlife. COVID-19 is a mild example. Bird flu, if it had gotten out of control, would have killed over 100 million people. And the burden is always disproportionately on people of color and those in poverty. Zoonotic disease examples are rampant. 75% of emerging diseases are zoonotic. There's Ebola, HIV, SARS, MERS, rabies, swine flu, bird flu, anthrax, West Nile, hantavirus, and then all the insect vectors, malaria, Lyme, yellow fever, Zika virus, dengue fever. And this crisis has 3 totally interconnected legs: wildlife exploitation, declines in habitat, and spillover to human health. Next slide, please. There has been an 82% decline of wild animals on Earth in the last 50 years. 1 million species are at risk of extinction, and today only 4% of mammals on Earth are wild. Wildlife is increasingly exploited with human population growth. It's illegal trade, poaching, bushmeat, wet markets, hunting, legal trade, and within all of these animals, wildlife carry thousands of viruses. They always have, but wildlife under stress shed more virus. And wet markets can be dangerous to humans as well as livestock, and they can degrade species. At the same time, studies show that higher diversity of animals means a lower chance of spillover. So ecosystems are also being degraded. That's the second leg. This is happening everywhere on Earth, including the United States, through development, agriculture, urbanization, and industrialization. Often there are no or few limits on burning, logging, and clearing land. Climate change is further stressing ecosystems with, and you all see it, drought, flooding, snowpack loss, and temperatures rising. All of these factors lead to more and more human-wildlife contact and spillover disease. So what's the solution? Next slide, please. This is a new, not really a new concept called One Health. It's been around actually since 2004. It was originally housed in the World Health Organization. And this is an active collaboration between scientists, organizations, and agencies to better share their interests, their strategies, their issues, because they're finding that you have to save wildlife and you have to save ecosystems in order to save humans, because they're all totally interconnected. Last slide. So some solutions real quickly for states, and then I wanted to mention a national solution. States this year are trying to restrict animal trade of species that are zoonotic risks, as well as some wet markets. California nearly passed a bill last year, and they're probably going to reintroduce their bill. New York, Oregon, and New Hampshire. New York has introduced their bill. Oregon and New Hampshire are in drafting. Another strategy is to regulate the pet trade a little better. In my state, Washington, where I am, there is no regulation of pet trade or wildlife breeding farms, such as mink farms. Our state has a proviso to fund a study for that and make recommendations. You can also restrict intrastate wildlife trafficking of animals who might carry diseases. The species that are listed under the CITES Treaty on Limiting Trade are included in many of these statutes, and we now have 12 states in Washington, D.C. who restrict wildlife trafficking. And then states within their health departments and elsewhere can increase their detection, testing, and response to outbreaks, and they can strengthen their surveillance and enforcement, and they can really communicate state to state, which hasn't been done in the past, but is being shown that it's very, very important. I wanted to mention in closing that there is a national effort, and this is well, there are several bills, but the one I want to highlight is the Global Wildlife Health and Pandemic Prevention Act. It was introduced in May last year by Republican Lindsey Graham and Democrat Chris Coons. And this promotes the One Health approach, and it would prioritize closure of high-risk wildlife markets around the world, but would provide support to have nations do that and improve their market conditions. It would try to stay aware of cultural and food needs and help increase detection, testing, and response. Haven't seen that bill move yet, but the language is quite good, and states could track that language if they want to do their own bills. So that's the end of our conservation issues we wanted to talk about. And now I want to turn it over to Clara to tell you how Arizona can deal with their energy issues. Clara?
Thank you so much, Ruth and Kate. That was a fascinating and hopeful overview of what can be done to conserve Arizona's lands and wildlife. So as we transition to discuss ways to address climate change, I'd like to take a moment to introduce my colleague, Amanda Ormond. Amanda has worked in energy and public policy for more than 30 years in Arizona and the West. Amanda is a director for the Western Grid Group, and for the past 19 years, she has managed Ormond Group LLC, a consulting firm specializing in clean energy policy and electric transmission efficiency. Prior to consulting, Amanda served as the governor's appointed director for the Arizona Energy Office. Amanda, take it away.
Great, thank you so much, Clara. I wanted to give a special shout out and thanks to Sandy Barr, who puts together Environmental Day. I think I didn't participate last year, but I have in many of the environmental days. And I think it's really critical to get into our legislators to let them know how much all these actions really will impact citizens and how important it is. A lot of the bills that we're going to talk about are in your packet of information, and so you have some of those, and hopefully we'll add some additional color and detail for them. But I wanted to start with the Arizona Corporation Commission and carbon rules, because if we think about what we want to do for climate change, one of the most effective things we can do is have a carbon reduction standard in place. And as you can see on the slide, there's a number of states that have adopted, either by policymakers at the Public Utility Commission or by legislatures, carbon reduction goals. It's important to note that all Arizona's utilities have adopted internal carbon goals. APS has a 100% carbon reduction goal by 2050. That's great, but I think what we know now is that it can be done a lot faster. So the Arizona Corporation Commission started out about 2 years ago to update the energy rules that have to do with a lot of different topics that I'll cover in just a second. And they have received thousands of comments. Businesses are engaged, individuals, corporations, governments, all stating that we need to modernize our energy rules because we're living off a 2006 policy to have 15% renewable energy. I also wanted to mention that from a policy standpoint, Renewable energy standards, where you dictated a certain amount of renewables, is kind of an older policy. I think the newer policy is doing carbon, because it really is the direct thing that we want to attack when we think about climate change. So these energy rules are very comprehensive. They have goals of 100% carbon-free energy by 2050, and this would affect Tucson Electric Power and Arizona Public Service Company. Really importantly, in these rules, there's an energy efficiency requirement for utilities. This rule that they have now is expiring this year, so if it's not continued, it means there's going to be a lot less conservation and efficiency services for businesses and individuals. It has a battery standard that's quite innovative. We want to be using the newest technologies. It's good for customers. We want to drive down the costs. And then it has a comprehensive redo of the planning process. Utilities go through extensive integrated resource planning processes where they look at all kinds of different generation choices. The update that has been made in these rules provides for much more transparency and a lot more competition, because the utilities are now required to do bidding for energy resources. All in all, this package actually will drive down costs for energy, not increase costs, because the clean stuff, wind and solar, are now less expensive than anything else that the utilities can buy. So this is just good policy in the making. So next, please. So the legislature has a host of bills that are aimed at the Corporation Commission and either changing the authority of the Corporation Commission and changing possibly how it operates. There are more bills than just the two that I've got on the screen, but I wanted to point your attention to these two, because what the legislature wants to do is take or capture authority for any choice that's made by an electric utility that has to do with fuel. So when you think about what do electric utilities do, they produce electricity and they use some type of fuel to do it: solar, wind, nuclear. And the legislature is saying, Commission, you cannot adopt any policy decision or rule that has anything to do with fuel. You have to do your primary, which is in the Constitution. All this is in the Constitution, that they can continue to regulate rate making. The challenge with that is that I believe they're inseparable. I think when you think about what do you pay and what rates do you have to charge customers, it's all tied back to the fuel that you use. And so while I understand what the legislature is trying to do, the mechanics of what they're trying to affect, I don't think are understandable. And it will change the way that the state operates and the utilities operates. It throws into great uncertainty the business climate for Arizona. We are just starting to ramp up our clean energy development because the utilities now have these new carbon policies, and businesses are increasingly demanding that they have new clean energy sources from the utilities. That growth will stop because what will happen is that there will be uncertainty about who's in charge of what. And I can tell you from working this issue for a long time that it will end up in litigation, which means years of uncertainty. So we have a strong economic sector in clean energy that's threatening to be lost if these bills go forward. So they really are very problematic. So I didn't want to leave it with that. I wanted to make sure that I transition to something a little more positive, because there's lots that the legislature can do in energy that doesn't require getting into the jurisdictional authority of what's legislative and what's commission. There's some clear lines. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So there's some really nice climate legislation that's been offered this year. 1470 is a climate resilient planning. Super great idea to do resiliency planning, to be thinking about what's coming and what we need to do to attack the problems that we're going to see. And I think you probably all know this, but Arizona has very extreme climate. And when we look at the impacts of climate change, they're going to hit this state especially hard, both in terms of temperature, but in terms of water. And I'm sure Kate can speak to this more authoritatively than I can, but a lot of our species live on the edge because they're in these pretty extreme climates. And so it doesn't take much to push them over into extinction. So it's super important that this state in particular starts acting on climate. So 1470 would require an inventory. It sets up a resiliency plan and then does some benchmarking on greenhouse gas emission reductions. House Bill 2200 and SB1080 are greenhouse gas programs. Our Department of Environmental Quality currently is prohibited from working on climate action. That absolutely has to go. And then the last one is having DEQ actually being proactive and working on climate reduction. So there's some positive legislation out there. They're the right things to start with, and so we hope they will go forward. Next. So back to Clara.
All right, thank you, Amanda. So we've just been talking about and heard about how to curb emissions from the electric sector and plan for resiliency. And another sector with a significant impact on climate change is transportation, which actually constitutes the largest share of emissions in the United States. Fortunately, when you clean up greenhouse gas emissions from transportation, it also improves air quality. So electric cars don't have tailpipes, they aren't spewing out nitrogen oxides or carbon monoxide everywhere they go. So when you electrify transportation, it would do a lot to clean up Arizona's air. And it's also where the market is going. It's estimated that 30% of vehicles in the US are expected to be electric by 2030. And General Motors just last week announced that they will be selling only zero emissions vehicles by 2035. So it's where the market is going and also where a lot of public policy is going. Next slide. So states have been pretty active of late on electrifying transportation and promoting EVs. And there are many different ways to do this. One is by electrifying state fleets. So for example, Hawaii is exploring a phased no-cost procurement process where they would adopt an all-electric state fleet. This is important for a number of reasons about air quality. I'll just remind folks to stay muted if you're not speaking, please. So again, on air quality in transportation, the most vulnerable are suffering the worst effects of air pollution. That includes communities of color, low-income communities, and another major source of air pollution is actually school buses that are outdated. So Maryland has a pilot program where one county is switching over to electrifying all of their school buses. So children who are particularly vulnerable to air pollution and respiratory illness are not exposed to school bus related emissions. So there's a lot of hopeful work that's being done in terms of electrifying state fleets. Another way that states can support electric vehicles is by supporting adoption for the general public. One way is by creating incentives and rebates. And good example is Maine, which has an Efficiency Maine program that covers many forms of energy, but includes electric vehicles. And they provide rebates for purchasing electric vehicles of several types. And those rebates increase for low-income customers. So electric vehicles don't have to be unattainable. They can be available for people of all income brackets. There are also other ways to incentivize EV adoption that are non-monetary, such as HOV lane access. So EVs, electric vehicles, they need charging infrastructure to be feasible. And some of the barriers to charging infrastructure are legal rather than fiscal. So an easy change that legislatures can make is to modify building codes to make charger installation possible. And Connecticut is doing that at the point of property sales. Finally, the last thing I'll highlight on this slide is that states can be developing battery recycling programs now. As EVs grow widespread, it's really important that we produce and reuse the batteries in the most efficient and sustainable way possible. So battery recycling is still a developing technique, but it must be accelerated in order for us to electrify to the extent that we want. California has a commission that is exploring battery recycling and reuse with the goal of reusing or recycling as close to 100% of electric vehicle batteries as possible. So states can get ahead of this issue by making battery supply chains as sustainable as possible from the point of production to the end of life. And with that, I'll turn it back to Amanda to talk more about the EV context in Arizona.
Thank you, Clara. One of the things that's important to note about EVs is our metropolitan areas are out of compliance with a lot of the national ambient air quality standards, ozone, particulates, and whatever the third one is that I can't remember. And so electric vehicles, because they have no tailpipe emissions, can be a major strategy for reducing air pollution in the Phoenix metropolitan area and in Tucson and other places. And as you all know, air pollution is just a huge issue and people are very concerned about it, and there's not been a lot of action on it. So electric vehicles is a great strategy for that. I would also say there's tremendous opportunity and excitement around EVs. And I would suggest if you've never driven an electric vehicle, borrow a friend's, find one, because they are really phenomenal to drive. So I think that we're going to see tremendous growth. And Clara had mentioned that General Motors has now said they're going to only provide EVs, which is just absolutely astounding. So there are a number of bills that are in the hopper right now, which are good. The first one is SB1470, which would direct that the state fleet start being electric by 2022. We don't actually have to have legislation to do this. This could be done administratively, but I don't know that it will be done administratively. So it makes sense to have legislation to direct the Department of Administration to move in that direction. There's also 1102, which is more of an omnibus bill. This actually tries to support the public entities in their move to electric vehicles. So it talks about building permits both for homes and for cities and towns. As Clara mentioned, you have to put the infrastructure in, because one of the things that deters people from driving an electric vehicle is what they call range anxiety, not being able to go as far as you want on a charge. Although I will tell you that the newer electric vehicle models are getting hundreds of miles of range, which is comparable to a gas powered model, but you still need infrastructure out there. So these bills actually look at helping to set up pilot programs and provide some funding to cities and towns, and also for a home charging pilot program and municipal. SB 1131 and 2202 deals with vehicle emissions. So California and a number of states have adopted zero emission or standards about how many electric vehicles should be adopted in a state. And it's been very successful in California. Arizona, I don't know how much support there is for this today, but why it's important is that the manufacturers are only manufacturing so many vehicles. And without this type of policy certainty for the manufacturers, they're not going to sell vehicles here. In fact, if you want to buy certain types of vehicles, you literally cannot buy them in the state of Arizona because the manufacturers are not making them available. You can imagine that when you bring a vehicle into the state, you have to be able to train the technicians and have all the support systems. The manufacturers are going to places that have these mandates. So, you know, this is a way to build the market and build the certainty for electric vehicles. And then the last one that's on the slide, but I'll mention one more, is HB 2287. This actually appropriates money for the Department of Education to start moving to electric school buses. Again, as Clara mentioned, our diesel school buses are so bad for our children because they breathe that air for however long that they're on a school bus. So moving to electric is really important. And then I wanted to note that Robert Bulacek put in the chat that SB1470 adds $110 yearly fee to electric vehicles. There is an issue that if you're not buying gasoline, you're not paying a gas tax to support the roads. And the electric vehicle industry, from what I understand, is that they're not opposed to having fees because they recognize that they're not paying that gas fees, but they need to be appropriate. And so, it's easy to add kind of excessive charges that then dissuade people from wanting to buy electric vehicles. So it's not that there shouldn't be a fee, it just should be an appropriate fee for making up that difference or taxing them appropriately. So if we go to the last slide, I'm going to change topics a little bit. So I think many of you probably know that our coal plants in the state of Arizona and all around the country have become uneconomic. When you look at just the cost of fuel to burn in coal-fired power plants, their wind and solar are less expensive, and utilities are finding that they're turning off these power plants. They want to take them down and not use them anymore. And I do think it's an important distinction to note that environmental regulation is not what's closing these coal plants. It's absolute straight up economics. So we know in Arizona that almost every unit of every coal plant, we know when it's going to close, and it's going to close between 4 years and maybe 15 years from now. You also probably know that Navajo Generating Station, the largest coal-fired power plant west of the Mississippi, closed about a year ago and was just torn down. And so there's the concept of just equitable transition. We have communities that have had these large economic engines that have provided jobs and money and revenues and taxes. And these communities many times are small, and when these plants close, it devastates the communities. I'd like you to think about the parallel of base closures, military base closures. When the military decided to close a base in the area, they had a long trajectory of letting the community know, providing retraining, being able to provide economic assistance. That's what just an equitable transition is for coal plants, is thinking long-term about these communities that are listed or counties that are listed up here, and what is the economic impact? Because besides Navajo Generating Station, these plants have not yet closed. And so we have the opportunity to provide a glide path. Claire is going to provide some states that have looked at this comprehensively. My point to you is that Arizona has not. We have not had the conversation at the legislature about what do we do for these communities, and time is running out. So we need to start thinking about what could Arizona do, like other states have done, to support the economies of these small communities that impacts the school districts, nonprofits, individual families, counties, cities. So with that, I'll turn it back to Clara.
Thank you, Amanda. So as she said, we need a glide path. We need to have a way to employ these communities that have already given so much. So next slide, please. So states are already being fairly active about thinking about next steps for the just and equitable transition. Colorado has led by establishing an Office of a Just Transition, which requires retiring coal-fired power plants and coal-fueled electric facilities to submit a workforce transition plan 6 months before the facility retires. The bill also created an Office of Just Transition that provides labor and employment support for those communities and workers who were working in that plant prior to its closure. So other states have explored this model and are introducing legislation to create a just transition office. Another aspect to this is making clean energy jobs really good quality jobs. Now, keep in mind that not all communities that were fossil fuel producing communities will be able to or even interested in producing clean energy instead. This is just about making sure that clean energy jobs are also really good jobs. So Illinois has a Clean Jobs Workforce Hubs program, which would provide support for members of economically disadvantaged communities. So not only displaced fossil fuel workers, but also folks who have had trouble accessing the same types of good quality employment that's been available to others. So this includes environmental justice communities, communities of color, returning citizens, foster care communities, and others. So there's a need for targeted hiring and targeted support for these populations, but also targeting the jobs themselves to make sure that they're really high quality. And Washington State created tiered tax incentives for clean energy projects that could demonstrate that they were meeting certain job quality criteria. That includes things like a project that promotes prevailing wage, or has a project labor agreement, or has an apprenticeship program that targets folks from underrepresented communities. So there are many ways that we can make sure that the clean energy transition is just and equitable, and it's really exciting to see what states are doing in that vein. So next slide. Aware that you probably have a lot of questions because this has been a ton of information. Before I turn it over to Kate on questions, I just want to mention again that if there are any legislators who are interested in being a member of NCEL, you're welcome to join. I'll put information for how to do that in the chat, and you can also reach out to any of us on the NCEL team if you're interested. With that, I'll turn it over to Kate.
Awesome. Thanks, Clara. We'll put those email addresses into the chat for everybody. Again, thank you for joining today. I particularly work in the conservation sector, and so it's always interesting to pair up with climate folks who seem to be in kind of different silos, but climate and conservation, in addition to being alliterative, truly do work in concert. As I learned today, you know, efforts to produce clean air can reduce pressures on wildlife, which can reduce zoonotic diseases. So they are really working together. And as I kind of parse through some of the questions in the chat to get one of yours up, I guess the first one I'll pose to our speakers today is the question of how do you think climate and conservation policies can coexist in the Arizona legislature to support each other without competing for spots?
This is Amanda. I'll take a crack at that, and happy to have anybody add in. So I think part of it is building the constituencies through the individual legislator interest that can support these different policies. With this Corporation Commission policy on carbon, 2 years ago, we couldn't talk about carbon at the PUC, at the Corporation Commission. And so we've seen a lot of change quickly. And I think that is the legislature ready for carbon policy? I don't know. And so I think it takes a couple years to build, you know, that knowledge base among certain legislators, having the business community heavily engaged and other stakeholders to let legislators know that this is really important. So I think they do go hand in hand, but I think conservation has, I think, a broader base at this point than any action on climate does. And, you know, the bills to prohibit ADEQ from doing anything are kind of, that's where the state has been. We've not only not supported climate action, we've actually acted to stop it.
I would just add that I think that climate and conservation go together so naturally because everything about conservation is impacted by climate. And I guess we deal within conservation more on climate adaptation, but climate adaptation can't happen without the actual climate energy work. And so for me, it's almost like the One Health visualization that we really have to cross over and work among each other. We have three main buckets of work at NCEL: climate and energy, environmental health, and conservation. And the more we talk together, the more we find out that it's just a rainbow of issues that cross over in many, many ways. And the more we do that, the richer the issues become. And I think the better the solutions can be.
Awesome. Thank you, Amanda and Ruth. And I see Rep. Dalessandro has her hand up. Please jump in.
Yes, thank you so much. I especially appreciate the business connection to all of this, because when I explained my vote in opposition to clipping the wings of the Corporation Commission, I pointed out that the Arizona Technology Council was in opposition to it because they are the innovators, and they want, many of their members are working on sustainability and energy efficient systems and operations. So I'm really seeing Arizona at a turning point. Maybe not this session, but I see that business has a big influence on policy in the state, and they're seeing that it makes sense to have renewable energy. Thank you.
Yeah, if I can add on that just briefly. So you're absolutely correct, and thanks so much for pointing out to your colleagues that the Arizona Tech Council is on board, and they represent a lot of the smaller Arizona manufacturers. The other end of that spectrum is the Googles, the Apples, the Microsofts. All those folks have been down at the Arizona Corporation Commission saying, we can't expand in your state unless you can give us clean energy. So we have the both and. We have the small, local, entrepreneurial up to the really big energy consumers.
Awesome. Claire, is there anything that you would add to that before I look to other questions?
I mean, I think you all covered it beautifully. The one other thing I'll say is that it's not just climate and conservation, it's also environmental health and environmental justice. And as Ruth mentioned, that One Health model, the health of people is intrinsically tied to the health of our environment and vice versa. And if we create a more equitable and just society, that also leads to better environmental outcomes, because human inequality is also a contributor to pollution hotspots in particular. So if we really value each other as much as we should in an equitable fashion, then we wouldn't have any dumping zones for pollutants. We wouldn't have pollution hotspots. So by caring better for each other and for the environment, then everyone wins. So I really love what everyone has said about combining approaches and really thinking holistically about what needs to be done for both people and the environment.
Thanks, Clara. And Dan, I think you said it best. Dan Stormont put in the chat, climate justice should be front of mind in all that we do. Can't agree more. And so I'm looking now, Rhonda asks, what could be possible with a real threat versus the snail's pace of policy action? And so Rhonda, is there anything you'd like to elaborate on there if you're still on the call?
I don't think so. Sorry, I'm masked up and dealing with something, but not really. I'm just concerned that we have a lot of goals that we need to hit, and yet policy debates continue, bills get held up, they don't get passed, so another year goes by and another year goes by, and I'm just wondering what we might be able to do more rapidly.
You know, my short answer to that would be bring more voices to the table, increase pressure, have, you know, Environmental Day is a great example of having people contacting those that they elect to say, this is what I want. At the commission with the energy rules, the amount of participation this year I've never seen, or the last couple of years. So I think that that's really important. I also want to share a conversation that Claire and I had yesterday. Because I've worked in the field so long, I'm pretty optimistic because we've gone so far from where we were when I started 30 years ago, and the pace of change is speeding up. But yet Clara, you know, admitted to me that she's pretty pessimistic because we have a decade of time to get these climate actions. So maybe part of it depends on where you stand in that spectrum. We certainly have to move much, much faster. And I'm hoping that Arizona is starting to build that understanding about action is necessary. And the other thing is that climate action is a positive thing. It's a job creator. It helps the environment. It addresses social justice. So, you know, there are so many well-rounded benefits, kind of back to the, you know, the interconnectedness. So this is in everybody's best interest. We just haven't quite convinced everybody of that yet.
Good point. And it's, yeah, I would say it's increasingly difficult this session, given a lot of the priority that COVID and pandemic bills are taking in terms of priority and precedent, which of course, that's kind of the first issue to address, but it's also, you know, as Ruth pointed out, zoonotic diseases are kind of driven by some of climate inequities, climate injustice, climate issues, and conservation issues as well. So it's kind of this double-edged sword. It's like, which one do we address first? Even though the pandemic seems to be kind of the immediate issue, climate and conservation have kind of been these loudly screaming drivers for many, many years. And so I'm looking at the time. I know we have 5 more minutes. I'm looking at Linda's question. Besides the Arizona technical associations, are there any suggestions for working with the, quote, very conservative Arizona Chamber of Congress? Would anybody like to speak to that?
Well, the Arizona Chamber of Commerce, I'm not sure if you're talking about, oh, the Arizona. So I guess I would say it's the same message. The more voices that we have saying we have to have clean energy, we have to have conservation, we have to have species protection, we have to have environmental justice, the more pressure we can put, the more action that can be taken. I'm interested in NCEL's opinion about what they've seen work in other states. Have you seen any states that have really rapidly changed, and what did you see as the result? Why did that happen?
I have seen some of that in New Mexico, and some of that was due to voters turning out and voting for new people who are progressive and educated and understand the issues, and or they've walked the talk like Deb Haaland, and they know what it's like to be subject to environmental inequity. So things have changed pretty quickly in New Mexico in terms of policy, but a lot of that, you know, was driven by voters who vote for diversity and who vote for women and who vote for progressive issues.
And the chambers are just made up of their members. So there's companies in the chambers. So thinking about, you know, what companies are there that could help support a more progressive agenda, I think helps. We've had some pretty major change in our electric utilities direction. And I think that that may have an impact on all the chambers.
I'll also add on the business side of things that business is such a large umbrella term. And as Amanda said, it really depends on the companies. There have been many business networks that have been really heavily advocating for climate action, and particularly in the form of carbon pricing. So from the business community perspective, what is most effective is something that has certainty. So if you have like an economy-wide carbon price, then that helps them plan. And there are businesses that want climate action. I know many states have an active Sustainable Business Council that speaks out, and I've seen that happen consistently in the Northeast as well. So it's a matter of building coalitions and finding out what each person's individual stake is in climate change and the climate crisis writ large, because we all have one. Everyone has a personal story, whether it's they've experienced wildfires or they're seeing drought, or they've noticed that not as many pollinator species are coming to their garden. People are seeing it. It's a matter of putting 2 and 2 together and telling the story, and then talking about what the hopeful action is. Because I know Amanda mentioned my pessimism, and I think that's more because of the speed of progress already in my life, but I am optimistic in that I have seen things speed up quite significantly, and a lot of that is due to young people. I know we'll have some young people speaking later today. who are seeing the magnitude of this crisis, and we're just experiencing the effects of it more rapidly. So coalition building is important, and talking to legislators and supporting your legislators who are doing good work, because they want to hear from you if they are working on an environmental priority that you're excited about. They need to hear from you when the work that they're doing is really good, and not just when you oppose something. So that's something to keep in mind.
Thanks, Clara. I think we're at time right now. Any closing thoughts from Representative Dalessandro or Clara?
I would just like to say that one of the topics that we talked about, habitat connectivity and corridors, those bills in other states have passed sometimes unanimously through both houses. Those are bipartisan, very popular conservation issues. And those are the kinds of issues that benefit people's health and safety if there are fences that keep elk off the road. And I think people are realizing, not just through One Health and not just through this pandemic, but that nature really impacts us, and our treatment of nature really impacts people, especially people of color. And so I'm hopeful that all of these ideas are coming together now. Sorry, I know we're out of time.
I just want to say thank you to all of the presenters, to NCEL, to Sandy Barr and the Sierra Club, and please note that my district is pictured with the background to Ruth Musgrave's beautiful Patagonia, where they do a lot of wonderful connectivity for wildlife and other things. So hopefully someday we'll all be on a great tour down there and be together. So thank you and stay safe.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much.